My name is Marcus, and I was 22 years old the night my father told his entire world I was nothing. It was his retirement party. 35 years of service in the United States Army, and the banquet hall was full of brass, colonels, generals, decorated officers, and their immaculate spouses. The air in the room was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and polished leather, the quiet clink of ice in crystal glasses, the low hum of respect. My father stood at the head of the room like a king surveying a kingdom he'd built with sheer willpower. Command Sergeant Major Robert Upton. A legend. A man whose name was spoken with a kind of reverence usually reserved for monuments. I sat at the family table, tucked in the back corner near the fire exit, my dress blues feeling like a borrowed skin. My mother hadn't looked at me once. My older brother, Derek, a successful corporate attorney, had flown in from New York and spent the cocktail hour bragging about his summer house in the Hamptons. My sister, Claire, a surgeon, had arrived in a designer gown that cost more than my last 3 paychecks combined. They were the children my father was proud of. The ones with power and money and something to show for their existence. And then there was me. Just a lowly E4. A specialist. A nobody in the grand Upton family narrative. Stay with me, because the humiliation that night was not spontaneous. It had been brewing for years, a quiet marinade of disappointment that my father had never bothered to hide. You see, when I enlisted right out of high school instead of going to West Point like him, the silence in our house was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just looked at me the way you look at a broken tool, useless, slightly frustrating, not worth the effort to fix. From that moment on, I was the asterisk at the bottom of the family resume. The son who just couldn't cut it. I felt that weight pressing down on my chest as my father tapped the microphone, his broad shoulders squared, his silver hair catching the light from the chandelier. A hush fell over the crowd of 200 people. He smiled, that easy, commanding smile that had convinced thousands of soldiers to run headfirst into impossible situations. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice a warm, gravelly baritone. 35 years is a long time, and a man doesn't survive that long in this life without a strong family behind him. He gestured toward our table, and a spotlight swung over to illuminate us. My mother beamed, touching her pearls. Derek adjusted his tie. Claire smiled with the practiced grace of someone who wins at everything. "I want to talk about my kids for a moment," my father said, and I felt my stomach clench into a cold, tight fist. Because a man's legacy isn't just his service record. It's what he leaves behind in the world. I looked down at the tablecloth. White linen. A single water spot near my fork. I focused on that spot, trying to make myself small, praying he would just skip me entirely. Derek, my eldest, is a senior partner at his firm, a fighter, just like his old man, except his battlefield is the courtroom. Makes me prouder than I can say. Polite applause. Derek raised his glass. And my Claire, my brilliant, beautiful daughter. She's saving lives at Johns Hopkins. Top of her class. A miracle worker with a scalpel. More applause, louder this time. Claire touched her heart and mouthed, "Love you, Dad." A long pause. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant clatter of a dish in the kitchen. I didn't look up. I was begging the universe, begging every god I could think of, for him to just say, "and my youngest son," and move on. Just the mention. That was all I wanted. A crumb of acknowledgement for the fact that I too was serving, that I too wore the uniform, that I too existed. He cleared his throat. The sound was like a gun cocking. And then, he said, his voice dropping an octave, "There's Marcus." I finally looked up. He was pointing at me. His arm was extended, his finger a compass needle aimed directly at the center of my shame. 200 heads turned. I was pinned in the crosshairs of their collective gaze. "I'm proud of all my kids," he said, and his smile tightened into something hard and cold. Except that one. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room. People shifted in their seats. The air grew thick. My mother stared at her salad plate. Derek smirked into his whiskey. "Just a low-rank soldier," my father continued, his voice dripping with theatrical pity. "Enlisted. Never could quite find the ambition to be anything more. I guess the apple can fall pretty far from the tree." He chuckled, a hollow, vicious sound. "Son, try not to embarrass us tonight. You've done enough of that for one lifetime." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a living thing, a vacuum that sucked the air from my lungs. I could feel the pity radiating from strangers, the quiet relief from my siblings that it wasn't them in the spotlight. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my temples, a rhythmic, pounding humiliation that blurred the edges of my vision. My fingers found the edge of the table. Cold. Solid. The only real thing in a room that had suddenly become a carnival funhouse of shame. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the marble floor, a screech that sliced through the silence. I stood up. I didn't know where I was going to go. Out the back door. Into the parking lot. Into the night. I just knew I couldn't stay in that chair for one more second, absorbing the radiation of my father's cruelty. I felt a hand on my arm. Gentle but firm. I looked down and saw my wife, Lena, her eyes glassy with unshed tears, her jaw set with a quiet fury I'd rarely seen. "Don't let him win like this," she whispered, her voice shaking. But I was already retreating. I was already that 5-year-old boy who couldn't throw a ball right, that 17-year-old who wasn't good enough for the academy, that 22-year-old failure who was about to walk out of a party and vanish into the anonymous comfort of failure. That's when a voice cut through the murmuring crowd. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was utterly calm and completely authoritative, a voice used to giving orders in the calmest of storms. "Hold on." The crowd parted slightly, and a man stepped forward from the shadows near the bar. He was older, mid-60s maybe, with a posture that looked carved from granite. The 4 stars on his dress uniform glinted under the chandelier light like distant, deadly suns. General Morrison, the commanding general of the entire United States Army Forces Command. My father's ultimate boss. A man whose presence in a room could stop a clock. My father's smile was still frozen on his face, but I could see a flicker of confusion in his eyes, a brief, jarring crack in his kingly composure. General Morrison stopped a few feet away from me. He wasn't looking at my father. He was looking directly at me, his gaze intense and searching, taking in the ribbons on my chest with a slow, forensic precision. The room was deathly still. I could hear a woman's bracelet jingle 2 tables away. Then, General Morrison spoke again, his voice quiet, but carrying to every single corner of that silent hall, a question that landed like a grenade rolling to a stop at my father's feet. "Son, are you Major Upton?" The room held its breath. The word major hung in the air, a foreign object that didn't belong in my father's narrative. I could see the confusion rippling across faces, the slight tilts of heads as people tried to reconcile the general's question with the humiliating introduction they'd just witnessed. My father's smile was still frozen on his face, but it was no longer a smile. It was a mask that had forgotten what emotion it was supposed to be showing. The microphone in his hand dipped slightly, his grip loosening. "General Morrison," he said, his voice a shade too loud, a shade too eager. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is my son, Marcus. He's a specialist. Enlisted. Barely made it through basic, if I recall." The words were meant to be a correction, a gentle reminder to a superior officer that he'd made a mistake. But General Morrison didn't even glance at him. His eyes remained locked on mine, waiting for an answer. The silence stretched, a taut wire vibrating with tension. I could feel Lena's hand tighten on my arm, a silent anchor. This was the moment. The moment I had never planned, never sought, but had always known might come. I straightened my back. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but I saw the general register it. "Yes, sir," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "Major Marcus Upton. 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta." The silence that followed was not the same silence that had followed my father's cruelty. That had been a silence of embarrassment and pity. This was a silence of shock. It was the sound of 200 people simultaneously recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Delta Force. The words whispered through the crowd like a brush fire, unstoppable and consuming. My brother Derek's smirk evaporated, replaced by a blank, uncomprehending stare. My sister Claire's hand, halfway to her wine glass, froze in midair. My mother's face, which had been a careful mask of detachment, crumpled into something I couldn't quite read. Confusion. Regret. Maybe both. General Morrison's stern face broke into a rare, slow smile. He extended his hand, and I took it. His grip was like iron. "I thought I recognized you," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that was entirely new. "I was at the Pentagon briefing 6 months ago. The black site extraction in the Alhasaka region. You were the team leader who went back into a burning compound for a downed pilot. The after-action report said you carried him 400 meters under enemy fire with a bullet in your shoulder." He paused, letting the words land. I could feel them hitting the room like physical blows. My father's face had gone an ashen gray. The microphone was now dangling from his fingertips, forgotten. I could see a single bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. General Morrison turned to face the room, and his voice took on the weight of a commander addressing his troops. "This man," he said, pointing at me, "is not a low-rank soldier. He is a commissioned officer who earned his way up from the enlisted ranks through sheer grit and exceptional performance. He holds a silver star, 2 bronze stars with valor, and a purple heart. He has spent the last decade in the shadows, doing things this country will never fully know about, so that people like us can sleep safely at night." He turned back to my father, and the warmth vanished from his voice. "Command Sergeant Major, you just publicly humiliated one of the finest special operators in the United States military. A man whose classified service record is so impressive, it makes your 35 years look like a routine garrison assignment." The room was no longer full of guests. It was full of judges, and my father was the one on trial. I saw his lips move, but no sound came out. He looked smaller now, somehow diminished, his kingly posture collapsing under a weight that had nothing to do with age. He tried to speak again, something about a misunderstanding, about how he never knew, but the words were clumsy and broken, tripping over themselves in a desperate scramble for the exit. This was the revenge. Not a scream. Not a slap. Just the truth, spoken calmly and publicly by a man whose authority my father had worshipped his entire life. The humiliation was complete, a surgical strike to the heart of his pride. I watched him fumble with the microphone, trying to place it back in the stand, but it slipped from his grasp, hitting the wooden podium with a hollow, amplified thud that echoed through the silent hall. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He just turned, his shoulders slumped, and walked off the stage toward the back door. My mother hesitated for a heartbeat, her eyes meeting mine with a pleading, desperate expression. I saw a lifetime of quiet complicity in that gaze, a marriage built on enabling his cruelty. She looked away first, then turned and followed him. My siblings stayed frozen in their seats, their faces a mosaic of shock and a slow dawning, terrible understanding. They had spent their lives basking in his approval, believing the hierarchy he had built was a reflection of objective truth. And in one moment, a stranger had revealed the entire structure was a lie built on ignorance and a refusal to truly see me. They didn't apologize. They just sat there, their silence a confession of its own. The party, of course, fell apart after that. People began to leave in quiet, awkward clusters, avoiding my gaze. The clinking of glasses and the celebratory music were replaced by the shuffling of feet and the murmur of subdued goodbyes. General Morrison gave me a firm nod, a gesture of profound respect that needed no further words, and then he too was gone. Lena and I walked out of the banquet hall into the cool night air. The stars were out, sharp and clear. I stood in the parking lot for a long moment, feeling the weight of a decade of silent rejection slowly, quietly lift from my shoulders. There was no triumphant joy, no surge of righteous anger. There was only a deep, resonant quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not from victory, but from being seen. Truly seen. Driving home, Lena held my hand. The engine hummed a soft lullaby. I thought about my father, about the shame that would now follow him for the rest of his days. He had spent his life building a monument to his own ego, and he had used my silence as the cornerstone. Now the cornerstone had become the crack that shattered the entire structure. I didn't need his apology. I realized, somewhere on that quiet drive, that I had stopped needing it years ago. I had built a life not on his validation, but on a truth I carried in my bones. A truth that no speech, no cruel word, no pointed finger could ever touch. My father had tried to write my story as a footnote of failure. But stories have a way of being told right in the end. And all I had to do was stand there. I won not by fighting, but by existing as the man I already was. And that, I think, is the most permanent kind of victory there is.